I've returned recently, and I'm going to do a course to the work of this Romanian historian of religions, Mircea Eliade, who's not nearly as well known as he should be, and whose work, by the way, is a real antidote to the postmodern, nihilistic, Marxist stream of literary interpretation that the universities as a whole have adopted. And Eliade is like that too. I used this book called The Sacred and the Profane quite extensively in a book that I'm releasing in mid-November, We Who Wrestle with God, and it's of the same sort. It's endlessly analyzable. Eliade walked through the whole history of religious ideas, and he had the intellect that enabled him to do that, and everything he wrote is dreamlike in its density. So every sentence or paragraph is evocative in an image-rich manner, and that also, what would you say, deepens and broadens the scope. And that's part of often what distinguishes writing that has a literary end from writing that's more merely technical. Like the literary writings have this imagistic and dreamlike reference space around them. And it takes a long time to turn a complex image into something semantic. And so if your writing evokes deep imagery, it has a depth that can't be captured merely in words. And the great romantic poetic philosophers, Nietzsche is a very good example, Dostoevsky is a good example, so is Mircea Eliade. They have that quality. And it's a good way of thinking about it. You know, it's kind of interesting from the perspective of technical analysis of intelligence. There's a good book called The User Illusion, which is the best book on consciousness that I ever read. It explains the manner in which our communication is understandable in this manner. So imagine that when you're communicating something, you're trying to change the way that your target audience perceives and acts in the world. So that's an embodied issue. But you're using words which aren't equivalent to the actions themselves. You can imagine that the words are surrounded by a cloud of images that they evoke, and that the images can be translated into actions. Yeah, and the greatest writing uses words in a manner that evokes images that profoundly affects perception and action. And so I would take the manner in which I act and behave, I would translate that into a set of images. My dreams do that for me, for example. Then I compress them into words. I toss you the words, you decompose them, decompress them into the images and then into the actions. And that's what happens in a meaningful conversation. It's a very good way of understanding how we communicate linguistically.
So if the words spring to the full visual complexity, and then that can then transform itself into action.
Yeah. And change in perception. Because change in perception. Well, those are both relevant. And it's an important thing to understand, because the classic empiricists make the presumption, and it's an erroneous presumption, that perception is a value-free enterprise. And they assume that partly because they think of perception as something passive. You know, you just turn your head and you look at the world and there it is. It's like, perception is not passive. There is no perception without action, ever. And that's a weird thing to understand, because even when you're looking at something, like your eyes are moving back and forth, if they ever stop moving for a tenth of a second, you stop being able to see. So your eyes are jiggling back and forth just to keep them active. And then there's involuntary movements of your eyes. And then there's voluntary movements of your eyes. Like what you're doing with your eyes is very much like what a blind person would do if they were feeling out the contours of an object. You're sampling, and you're only sampling a small element of the space that's in front of you. And the element that you choose to sample is dependent on your aims and your goals. So it's value saturated. And so all your perceptions are action predicated. And partly what you're doing when you're communicating is therefore not only changing people's actions, let's say, but you're also changing the strategy that they use to perceive. And so you change the way the world reveals itself for them. See, this is why it's such a profound experience to read a particularly deep thinker, because you could also think of your perceptions as the axioms of your thought. That's a good way of thinking about it. A perception is like what would you say? It's a thought that's so set in concrete that you now see it rather than conceptualize it. A really profound thinker changes the way you perceive the world. That's way deeper than just how you think about it or how you feel about it.